Picture a room in the court of Jerusalem. What is about to be written there? The opening of Proverbs 1 will quietly reshape everything we think we know about wisdom. It is the 10th century BC, give or take. But what matters is the moment. An anonymous scribe, someone whose name we will never know, picks up a clay tablet or a papyrus scroll. He spent his entire life collecting short sayings, observations about how life works, moral compass needles, you might call them. But he does not start with a commandment. He does not open with "Obey your father." He does not promise that wisdom will make you rich. He takes the ancient world's search for wisdom and places God at its center. And that reframing is the reason Proverbs 1 might be the most important chapter in the entire Bible for understanding how Hebrew thought actually works. The opening verses of Proverbs, chapter 1, verses 1 through 7, are what Hebrew scholars call a programmatic prologue. That is a technical way of saying this is not just an introduction. It is a manifesto. It is a declaration of intent that redefines the book you are about to read. The text begins like this: the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. To know wisdom and discipline, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right and just and fair. And then it says something aimed directly at the young and the inexperienced, giving prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. But it does not stop there. It says even the wise should listen and add to their learning, and the discerning should get guidance. And then comes verse 7. The hinge of the entire book. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now, stop there. Go back to verse 1. It says the Proverbs of Solomon. Notice what it does not say. It does not say the commandments of Solomon. It does not say the laws of Solomon. It says Proverbs. The Hebrew word is mishlei. It comes from the root mashal, which means to compare, to place alongside. A proverb is not an order handed down from the top. It is a comparison, an observation, a mirror that lets you see yourself. That is it, not a command, a mirror. And that is revolutionary. In the ancient Near East, when a king compiled a text, the point was usually to establish authority. Hammurabi carved his laws into stone so everyone would know who held the power. But Solomon, or whoever wrote in his name, did something different. He compiled observations about how the world works, not orders, observations. And that changes everything about how you read what comes next. Verse 7, this is the hinge of the entire book. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Here is where most modern readers get lost. The Hebrew word for fear here is yirah. And yirah can include fear. But it means far more than being frightened. Here, it carries the sense of reverence, awe, and a posture of the soul before something sacred. But there is a detail here that changes everything. The text says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, not wisdom. The Hebrew word is dot, not hakma. And that distinction matters. Dot is the raw material, perception, awareness, the ability to recognize what is real. Hakma, wisdom, is what you build with that material. Proverbs 9:10 will later say, the fear of the Lord is also the beginning of Hakma. But here, at the very start, the compiler begins with something more basic. You cannot even perceive correctly without reverence. The data itself is distorted without it. The text says yirah is the beginning, the reshit of that knowledge. And reshit can mean beginning, but here it carries something heavier. It points to the foundation, the ground on which everything else is built. Think of a building. Wisdom is the whole structure, walls, rooms, and roof. But yirah, that reverential awe of God, is not just the first brick you lay. It is the ground itself. It is what makes the building possible. Without it, everything else eventually collapses. That is not a metaphor the text uses lightly. It is the entire architecture. And here is where the text draws a line with surgical precision between two things that are easy to confuse. There is technical wisdom, in Hebrew, hakma. That is the ability to see patterns, to understand how things work, to make intelligent decisions. It is practical, it is useful, you can teach it in a classroom. But the real wisdom, the kind that actually matters, begins when you understand that all of that technical intelligence rests on a foundation that is not technical at all. It rests on a relationship with God. Verse 7 says it bluntly. The fool, in Hebrew, the evil, a person who is morally stubborn, who refuses correction, despises that foundation. Rejects that reverence, and because of that, it does not matter how much technical intelligence they have, they are not truly wise. Here is the thing, scholars who study the traditional Masoretic form of the Hebrew text point out that verses 1 through 7 function as something completely different from the rest of the book. Verses 1 through 6 are the compiler describing the purpose. Who is this book for? What will you gain from reading it? But verse 7 does something else entirely. It shifts the tone. Suddenly, you are not in the world of, here are some useful tools. You are in the world of faith, of reverence, of the one fundamental decision that defines everything else. It is as if the compiler is saying, look, I am going to give you a lot of practical advice in the pages that follow, but before you start reading any of it, you need to understand one thing. That advice only works if you understand that wisdom does not start with you. It starts with God, and that is a total reframing. In ancient Near Eastern literature, wisdom texts usually began with an attribution to the king. These are the sayings of King Amenemop. The emphasis was always on human authority. But Proverbs gives that wider wisdom tradition a distinctly Israelite foundation. It says the authority does not come from the king. It comes from God. And access to true wisdom requires a posture of reverence before that. Verses 2 through 6, the compiler is building an argument, and each verse adds something. Verse 2, to know wisdom and discipline. The Hebrew word for discipline is muser, and muser is not merely punishment. It is formation, instruction, correction. The willingness to be shaped, to learn from what went wrong. Verse 3 expands the circle, not just wisdom, but justice, righteousness, equity. The compiler is saying that if you read this book, you will not just learn to make smart decisions, you will learn to make moral ones. Verse 4, to give prudence to the simple. The Hebrew word for simple is pitayim. It does not mean stupid. It means open, inexperienced, vulnerable. The compiler is saying this book is especially for people who do not yet have defenses against the world. It will teach you to see traps before you fall into them. And then comes the turn. Verse 5, let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. The compiler is not saying this book is just for beginners. He is saying even if you are already wise, this book will make you wiser. Even if you are already sharp, you will learn new skills here. That is a bold claim. It is like saying this book has no expiration date. It works for everyone. Verse 6, for understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings of the wise and their riddles. He is telling you that proverbs are enigmas. They are not direct answers, they are questions in disguise. And if you learn to read them correctly, you will see patterns that other people walk right past. But then verse 7 arrives, and the tone changes completely. It shifts the tone. Suddenly, you are not in the world of, here are some useful tools. You are in the world of faith, of reverence, of the one fundamental decision that defines everything else. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Notice the structure, two halves. The first is a positive statement, the fear of God is the foundation. The second is a negative warning, fools reject that foundation. And here is where the text begins to reveal something that runs through the entire rest of the book. The rejection of wisdom is not an intellectual error, it is a moral decision. It is an act of rebellion. In Proverbs, this word for fool appears again and again. And always with the same characteristic. The fool is not someone who does not know, the fool is someone who refuses to know, someone who looks at the evidence and says, I do not care. Think about that for a second. The distinction is not between smart and dumb, it is between open and closed. Why does any of this matter beyond Proverbs? Because chapter 1 establishes an intellectual architecture that shows up everywhere. In Genesis, the tree of knowledge is not a tree of ignorance. It is a tree of wisdom, and the temptation of Adam and Eve is not ignorance, it is wisdom without reverence, the ability to choose without submitting to God. In the Psalms, over and over, the psalmist says, "Teach me your ways, not give me intelligence, teach me." There is a posture of openness there. Of humility, of being willing to be shaped. In Job, the entire book is an exploration of what happens when genuine wisdom, the kind rooted in reverence, reaches a wall it cannot think its way past. Job does not lack yira. Job 1:1 says it plainly. He feared God and turned away from evil. But his intelligence cannot explain what is happening to him. And the book forces a question that Proverbs 1 sets up. Is there a wisdom beyond the one you can reason your way to? In Deuteronomy, Moses lays the choice bare. I set before you today life and death, blessing and curse, choose life. That is the same architecture. You have the capacity to choose. But only one choice is wise, and it requires submitting to God. And when you get to the New Testament, Jesus often teaches in parables, comparisons, and stories that require openness rather than mere intelligence. And in Matthew 11:25, he praises the Father for hiding these things from the wise and learned, and revealing them to little children. The world's wisdom, technical intelligence, the ability to spot patterns, is not the same thing as the wisdom of God. In fact, it often works against it. And that is exactly what Proverbs 1 has been saying from the start. The word hakma, wisdom. Hakma comes from a root that means to be skilled, to have expertise. In the Old Testament, it is used to describe the craftsmen who built the tabernacle. It is used to describe the magicians of Egypt. It is used to describe someone who knows how to do something well. But hakma by itself is not moral. An Egyptian magician can have hakma. A con artist can have hakma. Someone who is an expert in deception can have hakma. What transforms hakma from a mere skill into a moral virtue is that it is rooted in yira, in that reverential awe of God. When we read Proverbs, we see practical advice about money, relationships, and work. And those tips are useful, but they are not the point. The point is that those tips only work if you are applying them from a posture of humility before God. That is why verse 7 is not an afterthought. It is the key that unlocks everything else. When was Proverbs compiled? Scholars debate this. Some place it in Solomon's time, the 10th century BC. Others say much later, during the Second Temple period, maybe the 4th or 3rd century BC. But here is what we know regardless of the date. Whoever brought these materials together was participating in a much larger ancient conversation about what it meant to live wisely. Across the ancient Near East, during the 1st millennium BC, there was what scholars call the wisdom movement. Thinkers in Babylon, in Egypt, in Syria, were producing texts about how to live well, how to understand the world, how to make good decisions. And some of those texts were secular. They did not invoke the gods at all. They just talked about how the world works. The compiler of Proverbs was in conversation with that tradition, but he was saying something fundamentally different. He was saying, yes, there is a practical wisdom. Yes, there are patterns in how the world operates. But that wisdom only holds together if it is rooted in a relationship with God. One distinction worth sitting with, the difference between yira and ordinary fear. Hebrew can also use words like pakad for dread or terror, the kind of fear you feel when you see a lion. That is a survival response. Yira often carries a broader sense. It is what you feel when you are standing in the presence of something greater than you, more powerful than you, wiser than you, and you recognize it. When Abraham stands before God in Genesis 22, the text says he had yira. He was not running, he was not screaming, he was standing in total reverence. When the psalmist says in Psalm 111, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom," he is saying the same thing Proverbs 1 says. True wisdom begins when you recognize there is something bigger than you. And that runs against everything the modern world teaches. Every self-help book on the shelf says, trust yourself, believe in your own reasoning. But Proverbs 1 says something else. Be confident, yes, but let that confidence be rooted in a relationship with God, not in yourself. Go back to the fool. The fool is not someone who lacks access to wisdom. That is what makes it so uncomfortable. The fool has access. The fool has access, he just rejects it. He sees it and says, I do not care. And in Proverbs, that rejection plays out in completely predictable ways. The fool speaks without thinking and causes conflict. The fool rejects the counsel of his parents and suffers for it. The fool is lazy and ends up in poverty. The fool is arrogant and falls into ruin. But here is the part that stops most people cold. Proverbs often present these outcomes not merely as external punishment, but as consequences woven into the moral structure of reality. It is saying, look, this is how the world works. If you act this way, this is what follows, because that is how reality is built. And that is what sets Proverbs apart from other books in the Old Testament. Proverbs is not primarily talking about God's law. It is talking about God's wisdom, and God's wisdom is written into the structure of reality itself. If you understand this, if you understand that Proverbs 1 is a prologue, establishing an intellectual architecture, then everything that comes after makes sense. Chapters 2 through 9 are extended speeches. A father talking to a son, saying, here are the traps, here are the people who want to deceive you, here are the roads that look good but lead to ruin. Learn to see them. And the reason you can learn to see them is that you have access to God's wisdom. You have access to a way of seeing the world that is clearer than the way fools see it. Then chapters 10 through 29 are hundreds of short proverbs, one line, one comparison, one pattern. Each one says the same thing, look at how the world works. And chapters 30 and 31, the sayings of Agag and Lemuel. Different voices, different angles, but all pointing at the same reality. There is a pattern, there is a wisdom, and if you learn to see it, you can live well. But none of that means anything without the prologue, without understanding that wisdom does not begin with you, it begins with God. The word muser, discipline, muser is not merely punishment, it is formation, instruction, correction, the willingness to be shaped, to learn from what went wrong. The opposite of arrogance, the opposite of a closed mind. It means think, but think from a posture of humility. The Hebrew word for despise in verse 7 is baz. It means to consider something without value, to look at it and dismiss it. And here is what matters, it is not accidental, it is not ignorance. It is a choice. Someone who sees wisdom and says, that is not worth my time. That is a moral act. The fool is not someone who cannot know. The fool is someone who chooses not to, someone who chooses not to grow, not to change. And in Proverbs, that choice has consequences that are entirely predictable. One of the most striking things Proverbs 1 does is redefine what it means to be intelligent. In the modern world, intelligence means cognitive capacity. The ability to solve problems, see patterns, and reason clearly. But in Proverbs, intelligence means something else. It means the ability to see reality as it actually is. To understand how the world really works, to make choices that lead toward life, not away from it. And that ability is not primarily a matter of intellect. It is a matter of character. It is a matter of being willing to be taught. Verse 5 says, let the wise listen, not read, listen. Listening requires openness. It requires the willingness to be corrected. A wise person, according to Proverbs, is someone who does not trust only their own judgment. A foolish person is someone who does, and that is a complete redefinition of intelligence. There is one more thing the compiler connects that is easy to glide past. Verse 3 does not just mention wisdom, it mentions justice, righteousness, and equity. Why? Because according to Proverbs, you cannot be truly wise without being just. Wisdom that is not in service of justice is not wisdom, it is cunning. A criminal can be cunning. A con artist can be clever. But they are not wise, because their intelligence is not oriented toward what is right. True Chokmah, the kind rooted in the fear of God, always bends toward justice. Always bends toward what is right. That is one of the features that gives Proverbs its distinctive moral and theological force. Other texts say, here is how to succeed. Proverbs says, here is how to succeed in a way that is just. So here is what Proverbs 1 is really doing when you see it whole. It is not giving you a list of good advice. It is giving you the operating system that makes the advice work. The compiler is saying this book is not a collection of tips. It is an exploration of how God built the world, an invitation to see reality the way God sees it. And that is what makes it distinctive within the wisdom traditions of the ancient Near East. When a king compiled a book of wisdom, it was usually to say, I am wise, do what I say. But Solomon, or whoever wrote in his name, did something else entirely. He compiled observations about how the world works, and then said, but here is the foundation underneath all of it. The fear of God. I am not asking you to trust me, I am asking you to trust God. And here is how you can learn to do that. If you understand Proverbs 1, you understand how the entire Bible works, because across the whole Bible, there is a tension between two things: human knowledge and the wisdom of God. And the Bible keeps saying the same thing. Human knowledge is useful, but it is not enough. You have to submit it to the wisdom of God. In Genesis, Adam and Eve have the knowledge of good and evil, but they do not have the wisdom to use it. And that is what ruins them. In the Psalms, the psalmist keeps saying, I do not trust in my own strength, I trust in God. The prophets say, the people trust in their own intelligence, but that will not save them. And in the New Testament, Jesus keeps telling his disciples, you do not understand, you do not see, you need to learn to see the way I see. All of that, every bit of it, is already contained in Proverbs 1. Already packed into 7 verses. So here is what I would ask you to do this week. Read Proverbs 1, the whole chapter, not just the first 7 verses. Read it slowly, read it twice if you can. And while you are reading, ask yourself one question. Where am I being the fool? Not where am I uninformed, where am I choosing not to know? Where am I trusting my own intelligence instead of submitting it to God's wisdom? Do not answer that quickly. That is not a question you answer, that is a question you live with. Because Proverbs 1 is not a text you just read. It is a text that invites you to change, to adopt a new way of seeing, to submit your intelligence to something bigger than yourself. And if you actually do that, if you really do, then everything else in your life starts to make a different kind of sense. In one word, what do you think separates knowledge from wisdom? Drop it in the comments. If someone in your life has been carrying that question, the one about whether knowing more is the same as being wise, send them this video. It might be the thing that reframes it for them. The scribe in Jerusalem did not start with a command. He started with a mirror. And nearly 3,000 years later, the mirror still works. He started with a mirror, and nearly 3,000 years later, the mirror still works. It is still showing us who we are and who we could be. It is still showing us who we are and who we could be. And that is the power of Proverbs. It is not just a book, it is a mirror. It is not just a book, it is a mirror. And it is waiting for you to look into it. So take the time to read it, to think about it, to live with it. It is waiting for you to look into it. So take the time to read it, to think about it, to live with it. You might be surprised by what you find. You might be surprised by what you find. Because the wisdom of God is not just for the past, it is for the present, and it is for you. Because the wisdom of God is not just for the past, it is for the present, and it is for you. It is a gift, waiting to be opened. It is a gift, waiting to be opened. So open it. Read it. Let it change you. Because that is what wisdom does. Read it. Let it change you. Because that is what wisdom does. It changes everything. It changes how you see, how you live, and how you love. It changes how you see, how you live, and how you love. And that is the best kind of change there is. So start today. And that is the best kind of change there is. So start today. Start with Proverbs 1. Start with the fear of God. Start with the fear of God. Because that is where wisdom begins. And that is where your journey starts. And that is where your journey starts. So take the first step. Read the first verse. And see where it takes you. Read the first verse. And see where it takes you. Because the journey of wisdom is a lifelong one, and it is worth every step. The journey of wisdom is a lifelong one, and it is worth every step. So keep reading, keep thinking, keep living. Keep reading, keep thinking, keep living. And let the wisdom of God guide you. Because that is the path to life. Because that is the path to life. And that is the path to wisdom. So walk it, and see what happens. So walk it, and see what happens. Because the path of wisdom is the path of life, and it is waiting for you.